Should the Higher Learning Commission launch an investigation of Youngstown State University to determine if trustees violated the HLC's criteria for accreditation, one of the questions it will confront is this: should the 3 trustees who voted for Republican right-wing Congressman Bill Johnson for president have removed themselves from the selection process because they had contributed to his political campaigns? The appearance of impropriety, or at the very least conflict of interest, on the part of trustees Charles George, Richard Fridd, and Joseph Carolla is as palpable as Johnson's embrace of Donald Trump's big lie that the 2020 presidential election was stolen from him. George, Fridd, and Carolla donated over $86,000 to the Johnson for Congress campaign between 2009 and 2022, and yet they had no qualms about choosing the 6th district representative for YSU president from among the 3 finalists for the job. Indeed, George and Carolla served on the 4-person search guidance committee. I'm Bertram de Souza, host of the Scribbler Video Podcast and veteran Mahoning Valley journalist who retired as the editorial page editor and Sunday columnist of the now-closed Youngstown Vindicator, where I had worked for 40 years. Today's podcast is a continuation of the campaign we launched weeks ago to shed light on the asinine decision of the trustees and Johnson's lack of academic fitness to lead a 4-year institution of higher learning. Johnson, whose academic credentials pale in comparison to the 2 other finalists, was chosen for his conservative politics and his public criticism of universities and colleges as cauldrons of liberal indoctrination. He has no interest in ensuring that YSU continues its long tradition of academic excellence and freedom of expression in the pursuit of teaching and learning. Johnson will give up his seat in Congress on January 21st and take over the YSU presidency on January 22nd. So, why should the Higher Learning Commission, the national organization that accredits the universities and colleges in this region, investigate the presidential selections process adopted by YSU's trustees? There are myriad reasons, but 2 of the most are these. 1, the process was shrouded in secrecy, which flies in the face of transparency required of a public taxpayer-funded institution of higher learning. And 2, the vote by trustees George, Fridd, and Carolla clearly violates Criterion 2 of the Higher Learning Commission criteria for accreditation. Criterion 2 is labeled integrity, ethical and responsible conduct, and states, quote, the institution acts with integrity, its conduct is ethical and responsible. If YSU loses its accreditation, the diplomas earned by students would be worthless for the pursuit of graduate degrees or being considered for top-notch jobs. My guest today is Dr. Janice Elias, Professor Emerita in YSU's Department of Family and Consumer Sciences and a former assistant provost. Dr. Elias was deeply involved in the very arduous task of ensuring the university's continued accreditation by the Higher Learning Commission. Thank you, Jan, for joining me today. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of YSU's accreditation and higher education in general, tell the viewers about yourself, especially your tenure as a faculty member at Youngstown State.
Okay, it's my pleasure to be here. I joined YSU as an instructor. My field was family and consumer science education. And while I was instructor, I began working on a PhD at The Ohio State University, which I completed, and rose through the ranks and became a department chair. And then when Les Cochran was president and Jim Scanlon was provost, Dr. Scanlon asked me to join the provost's office as assistant provost for academic planning. And a big part of my responsibility was to be liaison with the Higher Learning Commission that accredits YSU, assure that we met the accreditation standards, and also working with the professional accreditation of individual programs like nursing or physical therapy to make sure that the university was meeting all of our accreditation requirements. And so I think that's what has led to your invitation for me to talk with you today.
How long were you at YSU?
33 years full-time and 3 years part-time.
Okay, and then when did you retire?
I retired from full-time in 2013.
Okay, but are you still, and you're still involved somehow, right? You're still,
Well, I'm certainly a supporter. Right now, I'm serving on the Heritage Award Committee. I'm involved with the Retirees Association, try to do some fundraising. So I'm certainly a big supporter of YSU, but I am not currently teaching.
did you enjoy your time at YSU? Did you
Oh,
find it pleasurable?
it was wonderful. It was wonderful.
What was wonderful about it?
Well, I think YSU is a particularly collegial campus. I also think it was the right size, and it's large enough to offer a lot of resources to students and faculty, but small enough that the individual can actually make an impact on the institution. And it has a can-do attitude, and I think it's just so essential to the Mahoning Valley and our community.
And then, so given your deep regard for YSU, give me your reaction to what has been going on, starting with the whole search, presidential search process, and also the decision that the trustees made, because you've been long enough, like I have, to have gone through several of these, to have seen several searches take place, and to have seen several presidents being hired. So give me your assessment.
I was shocked when I first saw it. I thought this has got to be a joke. I couldn't believe it. I was very disturbed. As you may know, I wrote a letter to the editor
Yes.
of the Vindicator about that. I was shocked at the process, that all of a sudden a president was being announced and there hadn't been an opportunity for input from the constituencies. I was shocked at the qualifications, lack of qualifications of the person. I was concerned that in these polarized political times, I thought it was so unwise to appoint a politician from any end of the political spectrum that just is going to alienate people. And concerned about Representative Johnson's expressed attitudes about some things that I thought were incompatible with higher education and YSU.
And in the past, it has been my experience that members of the Board of Trustees were very aware of the community, not only the YSU community, members of the YSU community, but the community at large, and their support of the institution, their involvement in the institution. But it appears to me, and we have a prime example of what happens when you don't do that, and that was in 1991, when the trustees in a closed-door meeting, appointed the late Paul Dutton to be president, and the outcry was so intense, and led by, at the time, the Youngstown Vindicator, and I was one of the reporters on that story, that Dutton finally decided not to accept the position. Here it appears to me that the trustees and Johnson himself really don't care, because the outpouring of opposition to what the trustees did and to Johnson himself has been huge, and yet they don't seem to care at all, do they?
I think they don't know what they don't know. In other words, I don't think that they realize what has happened. They apparently don't think presidents need any particular knowledge of higher education, and I don't think they realize how devastating the decision is.
What would be, or what will be, the fallout, in your opinion, of Johnson being sworn in, of taking office on the 22nd of January, as he has said he will do, and the trustees have announced that he's going to do?
I really can't predict. I would say that leading a university is difficult under the best circumstances. No matter how popular the president is, hard decisions have to be made. Not everybody agrees with them. There's always going to be differences of opinion. It's hard to get people working together. And if you start out with having no support, no faith in your leadership, I don't know how you mobilize people to do the things that need to be done. I don't know that it would necessarily be active opposition, depending upon what the position is, but there's certainly not going to be motivation to help him achieve whatever his vision is, which we don't know.
Okay, and the university has already announced, and I guess tomorrow there's going to be a meeting where they're going to actually detail the program cuts that are going to be made, the degree cuts that are going to be made. They've already announced some, like at the Dana School of Music, and then they're going to eliminate geography, and they're going to eliminate some of the other programs. In the context of accreditation, let's talk about the actual programs and courses. First of all, explain accreditation, what it is, what it means, and why it's important.
Okay, accreditation is more than important, it is essential. An institution of higher education really can't operate without it. For example, students' credits that they earn, it would not be transferable to another institution. Students who would graduate, if it's not an accredited institution, wouldn't be eligible to be accepted into most graduate schools. Individual programs without institutional accreditation across the entire university, individual programs cannot be accredited, like nursing or engineering or business. That's the baseline. In order to have an accredited program in any of those professional fields, it has to be housed at an accredited institution. So there wouldn't be those accredited programs. Students wouldn't be able to obtain licensures. They wouldn't be able generally to get financial aid if it's not an accredited institution. So it's absolutely critical. That's the really important key thing, I guess. And let's see, what was the rest of your question?
And you know, why is it important? And you just laid out.
Mm-hmm.
So when you were involved in working on the continuation of, to ensure that YSU continued to have its accreditation, what was the process? What did you have to do? What kind of information did you have to put together and compile in order for the Higher Learning Commission to conclude that YSU was worthy of being accredited?
Okay, YSU has been accredited since 1945. And we're a mature institution, a quality institution, and so generally we're on a 10-year cycle for review. And the university was last had a full review in 2017-2018 academic year, and will be due again in 27-28, which is not that far away. No. Because the process actually really gears up about 2 years before that visit, which would be 2025.
Right.
The institution has to do a self-study where you generally have a steering committee composed of a broad representation across campus. You have committees for each of the criteria that the HLC sets, and their job is to evaluate what's going on at the institution according to those standards. And they generally, what each committee does is, they research. They might do surveys on campus. They look at documents. They interview. They collect evidence, and they write an evaluative report about how do we stack up against this particular criterion. It's supposed to be self-reflective, self-critical, evaluative. In other words, we don't just say, oh yeah, we meet that for sure, and here's all the great things that we do that show that we meet that. You also have to discuss where you might be falling short, what your weaknesses are. A failure to do that is a real red flag, because accreditation is a continuous improvement process. So it's supposed to identify not only your strengths and how you meet the criteria, but where you have problems. Then this is compiled into a large self-study. Now, it used to be a book that is printed and sent in. I believe now it's submitted electronically.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not as up to date on that. Then it goes to a committee, the Higher Learning Commission, of peer reviewers. And those peer reviewers read that document, and also evidence. The institution has to collect all kinds of evidence that they submit to back up what they say in the document. And they review those things, come to campus for a visit, 2 or 3 day visit. It might be a team of 3, 4, 5 people. The larger the institution and more complex, the more people it would be. And there they have meetings with groups on campus. They interview people. They look at documents. The whole institution is open to them. And then they evaluate, does the institution meet the criteria? They identify strengths and they identify concerns, usually. And they do a report at the end that goes back, also is released to the institution. The institution can respond to that. It goes back to HLC for further review, and then the commission votes on its status. Now, the team can make recommendations. They can say, everything's basically fine here. This university doesn't need another visit for 10 years, full accreditation. They can say, boy, there are major problems here, and this institution has to submit an interim report. We have to come back in 2 years for a focused visit. The institution needs to do X, Y, Z, different steps
Right.
to take to come into compliance. And so basically that's how it works on an ongoing cycle.
So you are obviously very familiar with the Higher Learning Commission's policy, and the policy title being Criteria for Accreditation. And it lists various components. The core component, the institution mission demonstrates commitment to the public good. And one of the criterion is integrity, ethical, and responsible conduct. Are you familiar with that one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Why is that in there? What does that mean? Why would the Higher Learning Commission include that criterion?
Well, it's fundamental, because that's a basis of everything else that the institution does. If it doesn't act with integrity, then you can have no confidence in the programs that are offered, the degrees that are awarded. It has to operate in an honest and ethical manner. And that's just one of the givens, yes. In fact, the commission requires that an institution have a code of ethics.
So YSU does have a code of ethics that has been adopted by the trustees and the administration and all of that it's supposed to follow. So in your experience, in talking about ethical and responsible conduct, that just apply, does it just apply to faculty and to the administration and to staff, or does it also apply to the Board of Trustees?
It definitely applies to the Board of Trustees. Yes, at all levels.
And give me your interpretation or your definition of integrity on a university campus?
Now I wish I'd majored in philosophy. Sure, I can sum that up. I will say that one key component of that is doing what you actually say that you are doing, following the policies that you say that you have. And that is where I think we have some issues with this recent event.
Right.
That is a big part of it. And also another component of that is avoiding conflicts of interest.
Right.
And there may be some issues related to that,
Yes.
as far as this hiring goes.
Yes. And so, you know, the whole process of selecting the president and the ultimate decision made by the trustees on an 8-1 vote to hire this political person, and my characterization of him being a right-wing Republican apologist for Donald Trump as president, obviously has garnered not only local but statewide and national attention. If the Higher Learning Commission received a complaint that said, we are concerned about the lack of transparency in the process, the requirement that public employees were required to sign non-disclosure agreements in order to be part of the selection process or in order to evaluate the finalists, and the lack of openness where the entire university community and the community at large were involved. If the HLC received such a complaint, would it be inclined to pursue that complaint?
It might. The complaint process, first of all, if anyone is considering filing a complaint, there's a procedure. They will only accept complaints online.
Yeah.
They will not accept complaints about personal things like they didn't give me a degree and I'm mad.
Right.
They within 30 days of receiving that complaint, they will acknowledge that they've received it and if they intend to investigate it. And they'll also inform the university that they've received a complaint so that the university can respond. Whether they would see this as egregious enough to take more action as far as questioning the university, it's a little gray. Usually they're not going to step in except in really in between regular reviews, except for the most egregious things like fraud and criminal activity and the buildings are falling down, that sort of thing. It's a gray area whether or not the criterion has been violated or not, because it's not black and white. You can be fully in compliance with a criterion or very much obviously out of compliance, but generally there's something in between in which there's a pattern of evidence. Yes, they're in compliance to this extent in this way. These are some examples. These are some problems. And that's being considered what they would call a concern.
Right.
Which they may want the university to respond to.
So you have the advantage of not only having been involved in making sure that YSU's accreditation continues, and you therefore worked within the system, but you have also been very much aware as to what has occurred since the trustees meeting on the presidency and also the appointments. So if you were sitting in the offices of the Higher Learning Commission and you received an email that detailed what went on and what has gone on, together with supporting evidence such as the study that was conducted by those 5 alumni from YSU alumni, and also, you know, all of the other evidence and all of the other, would you be inclined to say, you know, there is something here that needs to be examined?
Possibly.
Okay.
I think I have been a peer reviewer, one of the folks that goes to other institutions to review whether or not they're in compliance. So I could give you a little bit maybe more insight related to that. The road to withdrawing accreditation is a very, very long one. YSU is not going to lose accreditation because there will be many opportunities for the institution to self-correct. What I am concerned about is whether the board wants to self-correct, whether they have recognized yet that they've made a grievous error, and how do they go about trying to rectify it at this point? Is kind of a concern. For example, as we get ready to go into this next accreditation cycle, let's suppose that the Higher Learning Commission does or doesn't ask some questions about what's going on at YSU. Let's say they're getting ready to do the self-study and write about how they responded to the criteria. When they do this next self-study, they can't brush this under the rug. They can't say it didn't happen.
Right.
It's going to have to be in that self-evaluation. This is what happened. This is the reaction. This is a problem. But hopefully, by the time they get ready to do it, they can say, and these are some of the things that the board has done, that the institution has done to try to make this situation better.
Right.
I don't know what kind of development the Board of Trustees receives. The Higher Learning Commission has sessions for board members. They can attend their conferences. They have consultation services. There are ways for board members to learn about how they ought to be behaving. And I don't know anything about the current situation. But what would be really bad is if the same type of behavior continued. For example, we have board policies for how you go about hiring the executive officers of the institution, the vice presidential level administrative officers. And they clearly say that constituencies are going to be involved in the interviewing and selection process. But what if they decide that, well, we don't want that. We don't want that involvement. We're just going to hire people without that, and which would be a violation of the board's own policies. In other words, is there a continuing pattern of not following the board's own policies and accepted practice in higher education? Or does the board learn from this experience and try to do things differently?
So you talked about the hiring process and what the board's own policies are for at the vice presidential level. So it's not just president, vice president. Does that also apply to the special assistant to the president? Or is that a particular position where it is not considered part of?
No, I don't think so. I think that's a staff position, an assistant to. I don't think that would apply to that. But you can look up the board policies on the YSU webpage. Right. There's a set of policies for hiring. And also, they still have posted, there's a board policy for what you're supposed to do in hiring a president. Now, it's permissive, and it says it may appoint a presidential search committee, but it does say that it will consider the recommendations and comments from all constituencies.
Yes.
So I don't know how you will consider recommendations from constituents if you never receive them, or give people an opportunity to make them. So that seems to be in conflict with their own adopted policy.
The strength of a university or a college is actually based on the strength of its academic programs, because that in the end is what universities are and colleges are about. It's academics. So when the Higher Learning Commission comes in to evaluate an institution, and for example at YSU they hear that the Dana School of Music, for example, is not only nationally known but internationally known, has an international reputation, or the engineering department has historically been one of the strongest departments on campus, going back to the heyday of the steel industry and all of that. So do they look at the strengths in that regard as to what strengths the institution has academically? And if they do, how would they react to the fact that there are going to be cuts made, for example, in Dana at the School of Music, or they're going to eliminate geography, or they're going to eliminate some of the other programs? How does that affect accreditation?
They're more likely to be an accreditation concern if you're offering programs and you don't have adequate resources to support them, but you still say that you have them, but you try to keep them going, limping along with part-time faculty and inadequate funding and few students. That would be more of a concern. They would rather see. I hate to say this, but sometimes it's better to eliminate programs. You need to have the programs that you have need to be quality programs, and sometimes that means having to eliminate some. And in this time of declining enrollment and declining resources, I wish that weren't true.
Right.
But as far as accreditation goes, the Higher Learning Commission would not say, well, you have to have these particular degree programs.
So when you were at YSU, programs were cut, right? Programs were eliminated?
Oh, gosh. I'm trying to remember if there were any, not very many, because we were in more of a time of expansion.
Right.
During that time in the 90s. In fact, we were adding programs, particularly graduate programs, the first graduate programs that had been added in many years. So it was a growth time. We added physical therapy. We added, graduate programs. So I did not experience much in the way of them trying to, I don't remember very many programs being, I'm sure that there were probably a few. That's a natural thing because programs have become popular or less popular, or maybe there's only one faculty member left in the field and they retire, and that sort of thing. So it's natural for some programs to be eliminated and other ones to be started.
You were on campus when Les Cochran was president, right?
Yes.
And then were you there with David Sweet?
Yes.
And then also Cindy Anderson?
Right.
Okay, so you were there for 3 academics who became president, Cindy having grown up in the university and had been there a long, long time. All 3 have written letters in opposition to the trustee selection process and the hiring of Bill Johnson. The only president who has come out in support of the trustees and Johnson is Jim Tressel, a non-academic. What message does that send to the higher education community around the country as to what is going on at YSU?
I don't think it helps our reputation.
Could you expound on that, please?
Well, I think there were certainly people around the country who thought it was unusual to name a football coach as president. Although I have to say Jim Tressel has many excellent qualities.
Right.
And I would not criticize him, but there were people who just on principle don't believe that that's what you should that's what you should do. So
I was one of those,
I know there
by
was,
the way.
yeah, there was national press, about that. So I know that the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is like the Wall Street Journal of
Yes.
higher ed,
Yes.
had an article, and their headline was something to the effect that Youngstown State chooses, election denier as president.
Right.
In other words, we're not enhancing our academic reputation by choosing non-academics.
And in the case of Jim Tressel, the argument was made that, well, yes, he was a football coach both at YSU and Ohio State, but he also served as vice president at Akron before he came to Youngstown, and so had been around the campus, the university life, for a long time, compared to Johnson, who I don't believe had even visited the university when he first ran for office. I might be wrong, and I might be being facetious, but absolutely has no credentials, no connection to YSU in any way. But when the Chronicle of Higher Education does a piece like that, do people pay attention around the country? Do faculty, do vice presidents, do people who might be thinking of moving up, how is that kind of a story met in the circles of academia?
Yes, it's certainly noticed. I mean, as the main newspaper of the field, that's where positions are advertised. That's where people go looking to see where they might want to further their careers. And so, yes, I think it would have an effect on, people wanting to come to YSU. I mean, there's always going to be, turnover in administrative ranks. And, how will they attract good quality people to come to a university? That they want to have confidence in the leader. They want to believe that the leader maybe knows more than they do about higher education and the institution. And I don't think many people would feel that way. I think they would wonder, what kind of place is this?
The argument being put forth by the trustees, and in fact Johnson himself, is that, well, Johnson may not be an academic, but, like Jim Tressel, he's going to have the ability to raise millions upon millions of dollars, especially from Washington, which is a farce, but, a lot of people have bought into that he's going to bring millions of dollars from Washington to YSU. I can imagine Ohio State sitting back and saying, oh, absolutely, let YSU get millions upon millions for research and development, into high tech. But the argument they're making is that, well, a president is like the CEO of a corporation, and you have at YSU a provost who oversees academics. And therefore, even though Johnson might not know anything about higher education, he's going to have a provost who will guide him. Respond to that.
Yes, I heard people say, oh, well, what a president mostly does is raise money and do public relations. I don't think so. I mean, my door was 3 doors down from the president's for many years. And certainly that's an important part of what they do. But that's not the most important thing that they do. And I think anybody should ask themselves, no matter what field they're in, would you be comfortable having somebody come in, run your business, whatever it is, and they've not worked one day in it?
Right.
Before? That's an issue. But also the idea that somehow he's going to be able to bring money from Washington, well, why would he have the ability to do that as a former congressman? I don't recall him bringing big money to YSU while he has been a congressman.
Right.
Maybe I'm mistaken,
Nope.
but I haven't seen that occurring. And certainly I don't know that his ability to fundraise in the private sector, all we've heard so far is people who are unwilling to give. Maybe there are people who would be willing to give because of him or his personal connections, but we haven't heard that yet. Yes, the president does rely on a provost and a vice president, usually for finance and student affairs, the different areas. But in the end, as the old saying is, the buck stops there. He has to resolve sometimes competing interests among those different divisions about how you allocate the budget. Or you just can't let it go to 3 or 4 people to fight it out, kind of.
You said you had written a letter to the editor, and I'm going to try and see if we can post it or link it to this podcast. But give us the gist of what that letter, what you said in that letter, if you can.
Well, I made 4 points. One, that the process seems to be in conflict with Higher Learning Commission guidelines. And I don't know if I stated this in the letter, but it seems to be in conflict with the university's own stated policies, such as its shared governance document, Principles and Practice of Shared Government. 2, that the argument that you're going to get better candidates by having such a closed process makes no sense, since we're ending up with the least qualified person we've ever had as president.
Right.
Thirdly, that any politician is a bad choice right now. And even if the person chosen shared my politics, I would be just as unhappy. And fourthly, Mr. Johnson's statement that he could somehow leave his politics at home. I don't understand that. Your politics come out of your values. What values, lead you to take particular political positions? As he's saying, he doesn't have any values. He can discard his values. He doesn't really believe those things. That's troubling.
Right.
So those, I guess, what I would say would be the 4 main points that I have.
If, by some miracle, the members of the Board of Trustees, looking at you and your background, your experience, your knowledge of YSU, your academic qualifications, came to you and say, okay, perhaps we are having a re-examination of our conscience. Please tell us why we should withdraw our offer to Bill Johnson and start the search process again.
Oh my goodness. Well, since that's not likely to happen,
it isn't.
I can
but it'll make me feel better to hear it.
Well, in a typical search process, previous search processes, when it's open and the final candidates meet with candidates, it's actually like a courtship. The candidates interact with a lot of people. They try to build rapport. They begin to understand the university culture. The university begins to understand that person and whether or not it's a fit. And hopefully, at the end of the process, there's a meeting of the minds, and there's a sort of a marriage there, and everybody's pretty happy about it. Of course, there's going to be dissension sometimes. No, you're never going to have 100% of people happy. But in general, you're going to have the bulk of the campus happy about the situation. What we have here is a badly arranged marriage, in which, a person is being, forced on the university without its consent. And I don't look for that to be a happy relationship. I'm not sure. I wish I had some advice to give to the board to how to turn things around. People have given some good advice. I've seen some things written by other people about, discussions. And I think professional development is going to be very important for President-designate Johnson. I hope he would take advantage of those, go to the Harvard. They have a summer institute for new presidents. He has a big learning curve. And I think the board needs maybe to have a retreat and have a discussion about how did this happen. My guess is that there are board members who are very unhappy that they've made this decision. I would be amazed that they're not, if they're not, and they don't know how to get out of it. The only way I know is to, buy out his contract, which would be, I'm assuming, over $1 million. I can't see that happening. I think they've dug themselves in, and there's no way out.
Yeah, perhaps some of the donors who have withdrawn or withdrawing their support would be willing to put up the money to buy out his contract. Finally, Jan, you've dedicated more than 30 years of your life to YSU. What is your biggest fear going forward with Johnson as president and the Board of Trustees as composed now?
A downward spiral of inequality. I don't expect that he's going to be able to turn enrollment around. I don't know why his presence would do that. It's bad enough they're losing degree programs that the community has relied on, a lessening of community support, and of course we're so dependent upon enrollment as far as finances go. I'm also concerned about the campus culture. I worry about this idea that somehow the university has been indoctrinating students, and that has to be corrected in some way, because I don't think it's hard to indoctrinate young people. They have their own ideas. And so I would be concerned about that, the policing, of campus speech or faculty or programs, and I'm concerned about what's going on in Columbus, in which there seems to be a move to try to prevent certain topics from being discussed on university campuses. So, I am concerned about the future.
And also move to remove tenure for, and that's, it almost is reflected, what's going on in Columbus is almost being reflected in what's happening at YSU. Almost seems to be
connected.
The same mindset of, these universities and colleges are cauldrons of liberal indoctrination and therefore need to be shut down. Well, listen, thanks very much for joining me. I appreciate it. I appreciate you sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us. Like you, I don't expect things will change, but, we can always hope for a miracle, I guess. Thank you, Jan.
It was my pleasure, Bertram. Nice talking to you.
Nice talking to you, too. Republican Congressman Bill Johnson, a Donald Trump sycophant, will take over the presidency of Youngstown State University despite widespread opposition to his appointment on and off campus. The decision of the YSU trustees to give Johnson the job after a selection process shrouded in secrecy could well trigger a lawsuit and an investigation by the Higher Learning Commission, which is responsible for the university's accreditation. Because the YSU community and the Mahoning Valley community at large were shut out of the selection process, the Scribbler Video Podcast will give students, faculty, staff, and area residents the opportunity to be heard. We will be hosting a live call-in podcast in the near future. We will publicize the event, including the date and the telephone number. Watch for the announcement on WYSU, the Jambar, and on various online platforms. In closing, I thank Dr. Janice Elias for sharing with us her vast knowledge of YSU in particular and higher education in general. I also want to again express my appreciation to Andy Kunkel, the producer, technical director, and videographer of the Scribbler Video Podcast that's streamed on YouTube, Facebook, and other digital platforms.